What if I told you that the most peaceful place on earth could become your grave? That the silence you sought for healing would be the same silence that swallowed your screams? In 1993, a town of fewer than 200 souls became the hunting ground for something evil, something that wore a human face and walked among the living as if it belonged. My name is Sarah Whitmore, and I survived what happened in Mineral, Washington. Not because I was smarter, not because I was faster, but because the dead themselves refused to let their story die with them. This is my account. This is the truth that the newspapers never printed. And if you're watching this right now, I need you to understand something. You were meant to find this story. There are no coincidences. Before you continue watching, I need to ask you something. If this story reaches the right people, if it spreads far enough, maybe someone out there will finally come forward with the missing piece of evidence that could bring final closure. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Not for views, not for algorithms, but because some stories are too important to let them fade into forgotten history. The victims deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve answers. And you, right now, have the power to help make that happen. Mineral, Washington sits nestled against the eastern slopes of the Cascade Range, a community so small that everyone knows everyone, where doors remained unlocked and children played in the streets until the stars came out. Mount Rainier looms in the distance like a sleeping giant, its snow-capped peak watching over the valley with ancient indifference. The town grew up around the logging industry in the early 20th century, and by the 1990s, it had become a quiet refuge for retirees, artists seeking inspiration, and families looking to escape the chaos of Seattle's urban sprawl. My parents moved us there in the spring of 1991, when I was 16 years old. My father had inherited a small cabin from his uncle, and after losing his job at Boeing, he saw Mineral as a fresh start. My mother called it our sanctuary. For 2 years, she was right. The first thing you notice about Mineral is the quiet. Not silence. No, the forest is never truly silent. But the absence of human noise, the absence of traffic and construction, and the constant hum of civilization. It takes time to adjust. The second thing you notice is how dark the nights become. There are no streetlights on most roads, no glow of shopping centers or gas stations bleeding into the sky. When the sun sets behind the mountains, darkness descends like a velvet curtain, absolute and complete. Some people find it peaceful. Others find it terrifying. I found it both. My best friend in Mineral was a girl named Emily Carver, 17 years old with red hair that caught fire in the sunlight and a laugh that could make you forget whatever was troubling you. Emily's family owned the general store on the main road, the kind of place that sold everything from fishing tackle to birthday cards, where you could spend an hour talking to the owner about nothing in particular. Emily worked there after school, and I would sit on the counter eating candy while she rang up the occasional customer. We talked about boys, about college, about getting out of Mineral and seeing the world. She wanted to be a journalist. She wanted to tell stories that mattered, stories that changed things. I think about the irony of that every single day. The Carvers had lived in Mineral for 3 generations. They knew every family, every hunting trail, every secret the forest held. Emily's grandfather had been a logger in the old days, and he would tell us stories about the mountain, about the spirits that the native tribes believed lived in the waters and the trees. He told us about the old logging camps, long abandoned and swallowed by undergrowth, where men had died in accidents that were never properly investigated. He told us that the forest remembers everything, that the trees absorb the echoes of what happens beneath their branches. I thought he was being poetic. Now I understand he was giving us a warning. The summer of 1993 began like every summer before it. School ended. The days stretched long and golden, and the scent of pine needles and wild berries hung heavy in the warm air. Tourists began trickling in, mostly families heading to the various campgrounds and lakes in the surrounding wilderness. They came seeking adventure, seeking escape from their ordinary lives. They came trusting that nature would embrace them, that beauty could never harbor danger. They were wrong. The first disappearance happened on June 15th. A hiker named Thomas Riley, 34 years old, visiting from Portland, set out alone on a trail leading toward Mineral Lake. He told the owner of the motel where he was staying that he would be back by dinner. He never returned. Search parties combed the woods for a week. They found his backpack near a creek bed 3 miles from the trailhead, the straps slashed clean through with something sharp. They never found Thomas Riley. The official conclusion was that he had gotten lost, succumbed to the elements, and that animals had scattered his remains. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also a lie. 2 weeks later, a couple camping at a remote site near the foot of the mountain vanished from their tent in the middle of the night. Their car remained in the parking area, keys still in the ignition. Their food was left untouched, their wallets and identifications still tucked in their bags. The only sign of disturbance was a long tear in the fabric of their tent, a slash that ran from top to bottom, as if someone had taken a blade and opened it like a letter. The woman's name was Patricia Holmes. Her husband was David. They were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary. Their families would never see them again. I remember the day we heard about the Holmes couple. Emily and I were sitting on the dock at Mineral Lake, our feet dangling in the cold water, talking about a concert we wanted to attend in Seattle. Her father came running down the path, his face pale despite the summer heat. He told us to get inside immediately. He told us that something terrible was happening. For the first time since moving to Mineral, I saw fear in the eyes of people who had spent their whole lives there. That fear would only grow as the summer darkened. By the time July arrived, Mineral had transformed from a peaceful retreat into a community gripped by paranoia. The sheriff's department increased patrols, though in a town that size, that meant 2 deputies instead of 1. The FBI sent agents to investigate the disappearances, serious men in dark suits who looked completely out of place among the pine trees and rustic cabins. They asked questions, took statements, and left without providing answers. The newspapers began calling our home the Triangle of Disappearance, a sensationalized name that drew more attention than it solved. True crime enthusiasts started arriving, amateur investigators with theories about everything from serial killers to alien abductions. They treated our tragedy like entertainment. They had no idea what they were walking into. I started keeping a journal that summer, documenting everything I observed, every rumor I heard, every strange detail that seemed out of place. It was my way of processing the fear, of making sense of the senseless. Emily encouraged me. She said that observation was the first tool of any good journalist, that the truth always leaves traces if you know where to look. Together, we became unofficial investigators, 2 teenage girls playing detective while something monstrous lurked in the shadows we were probing. The first real clue came from Old Man Henderson, a Vietnam veteran who lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the national forest. Henderson was what the town called eccentric, which was a polite way of saying he struggled with the demons he had brought home from the war. He kept to himself mostly, emerging only to buy supplies at the Carver store or to drink at the single bar in town. But Henderson was also a hunter with eyes trained to spot what others missed, and he came to Emily's father one evening with a story that changed everything. He said he had seen someone in the deep woods, far from any trail, moving through the trees with the practiced stealth of a man who knew how to avoid detection. Henderson had tried to follow, but the figure had vanished as if the forest itself had absorbed him. What struck Henderson most was not the presence of another person in the wilderness, but what that person had been carrying. A large duffel bag, heavy from the way the man struggled with it, stained with something dark that Henderson's experienced eyes recognized immediately. Blood. Emily and I tracked down Henderson the next day, bringing him coffee and sandwiches as an excuse to talk. He was reluctant at first, dismissing us as children who had no business getting involved. But Emily had a gift for making people trust her, for convincing them that she took their words seriously when others would not. Henderson finally relented and shared what he had seen in detail. The man was tall, he said, wearing work clothes that suggested manual labor. He moved with purpose, following a route that indicated intimate knowledge of the terrain. Henderson had the distinct impression that this was not the first time this man had walked that path, that there was a destination in those woods that no map recorded. We reported Henderson's account to the FBI agents, who listened with the polite skepticism of men who dealt with unreliable witnesses daily. They thanked us for our concern and suggested we leave the investigation to professionals. They promised to follow up on every lead. I believed them at the time. I was young enough to still trust authority, to believe that the system worked the way it was supposed to. Henderson knew better. He told us that sometimes justice wore a badge, and sometimes it wore the face of someone who refused to let evil go unanswered. I understand now which face he was preparing us for. The disappearances continued through July. A solo female hiker, 28 years old, last seen at a trailhead parking lot. 2 teenage boys from a neighboring county, out camping without their parents' knowledge. A retired schoolteacher who went bird watching and never returned to his car. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: people entering the wilderness and simply ceasing to exist, leaving behind personal effects and slashed fabric as the only evidence they had ever been there. The community began to fracture under the strain. Some families left, abandoning their homes and their roots to escape what they could not understand. Those who remained divided into factions, some demanding more action from authorities, others turning their suspicion on neighbors they had known for years. I watched my mother grow thinner with worry, watched my father clean his hunting rifle every evening as if the mere presence of the weapon could ward off whatever hunted us. They discussed leaving. I heard their whispered conversations through the thin walls of our cabin, the fear in my mother's voice, the stubborn determination in my father's insistence that they would not be driven from their home by shadows. They tried to protect me from the worst of it, but there was no protection from the truth. Something evil had come to Mineral, and it was not finished. Emily's response to the fear was different from mine. While I retreated into observation and documentation, she became determined to act. She started spending hours at the small library in the neighboring town, researching the history of the area, looking for patterns that might explain the present. She became convinced that what was happening was not random, that there was a reason why our community had been targeted. She found articles about unsolved disappearances in the same region dating back decades, cases that had been attributed to accidents or exposure but shared the same disturbing characteristics. The slashed fabric, the missing bodies, the complete absence of any natural explanation. Now let me ask you something. Think about your own community, the place where you feel safe. How well do you really know the people around you? How much do you actually understand about the history buried beneath the surface of everyday life? Leave a comment below telling me what you would do if the place you called home suddenly became dangerous, if the faces you trusted became masks for something sinister. I want to know your thoughts because this question haunted me for years, and maybe hearing your answers will help me understand my own. Emily discovered that there had been a similar pattern of disappearances in 1971, centered around an old logging camp deep in the forest. 3 people had vanished over the course of one summer. Their cases eventually closed as accidental deaths despite the absence of bodies. She found an interview with a forest ranger from that era who had expressed skepticism about the official conclusions, who had believed that someone in the community was responsible. That ranger's name was Robert Winters. He had died in 1985. His son, Daniel Winters, still lived in the area. Daniel Winters worked as a handyman, taking odd jobs around Mineral and the surrounding communities. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had a reputation as someone who could fix anything. He was also tall, with the build of a man accustomed to physical labor. When Emily showed me his description, I felt the first real spark of certainty that we had found something important. But certainty is not evidence, and 2 teenage girls accusing a respected community member of murder would not be taken seriously without proof. We began watching Daniel Winters, a dangerous game that we played without fully understanding the stakes. We noted his movements, his patterns, the jobs he took and the areas he traveled. We discovered that he had access to nearly every property in the region, that his work gave him intimate knowledge of who was home and who was away, whose cabins sat empty, and whose routines left them vulnerable. We discovered that he owned a vehicle capable of navigating the rough forest roads, and that he frequently traveled to remote areas under the guise of maintaining fire trails and hunting cabins. Emily wanted to go to the authorities immediately. I convinced her to wait, to gather more evidence that could not be dismissed. Looking back, I wonder if my caution cost lives, if the days we spent watching and waiting allowed more victims to fall into his grasp. But I also know that without that patience, we never would have found what was hidden in the forest, and the truth would have remained buried forever. August brought a break in the pattern that gave false hope to the community. 2 full weeks passed without a disappearance, and people began to believe that whatever had haunted us had moved on. The tourists returned, emboldened by the calm and hungry for the beauty that had first drawn them to our mountains. The FBI agents reduced their presence, promising to return if new evidence emerged. Life began to resume its normal rhythms. But Emily and I knew better. We had watched Daniel Winters during those 2 weeks, had noted the restraint in his movements, the calculated way he performed normalcy, while something hungry lurked behind his eyes. He was waiting for something. We just did not know what. The answer came on August 17th, the night of the summer festival. It was an annual tradition in Mineral, a celebration of community that drew people from isolated homes into the town center for music, food, and the kind of connection that sustained small communities through hard winters. Nearly everyone attended. Emily's family ran a booth selling homemade pies, and I helped them while keeping one eye on the crowd, searching for Daniel Winters among the festive faces. He arrived at dusk, dressed in clean clothes that seemed strange on a man who usually wore the stains of his labor. He spoke to neighbors, smiled at children, performed the role of friendly community member with unsettling precision. I watched him move through the celebration like a predator surveying a watering hole, evaluating potential victims with the same assessment a hunter applies to prey. When his eyes met mine across the crowd, I saw something flash behind them, a recognition that made my blood run cold. He knew we had been watching him. He knew what we suspected. And in that moment of locked gazes, I understood that he was no longer hunting strangers. He was hunting us. I grabbed Emily and pulled her away from her family's booth, whispering urgently about what I had seen. She did not dismiss my fear, did not tell me I was imagining things. Instead, she led me to a quiet corner behind the community center and revealed what she had discovered that very afternoon. During her latest visit to the library, she had found an old newspaper article about Daniel Winters' father, Robert. The article was not about the disappearances he had investigated. It was about his dismissal from the Forest Service following allegations of evidence tampering, allegations that suggested he had protected someone from prosecution for an earlier series of crimes. Robert Winters had not been hunting a murderer. He had been protecting one. The realization struck us both with the weight of revelation. Daniel Winters had not developed his methods in isolation. He had inherited them. His father had known about the killings in 1971 and had used his position to cover them up, had taken his son into the forest and taught him the terrain that would one day become his hunting ground. The evil we faced was not the work of a single deranged mind, but a legacy passed down through generations, a family tradition of murder that spanned decades. We needed to tell someone, needed to share what we had discovered with people who had the power to act. But as we emerged from behind the community center, we found our path blocked by Daniel Winters himself. He stood in the shadow of the building, his face obscured by darkness, his voice calm and conversational as if we were simply neighbors meeting at a festival. He complimented Emily on her family's pies. He asked about my parents, inquiring after their health with the concern of a friendly acquaintance. And then he mentioned, almost casually, that the forest was particularly beautiful at night this time of year, that he sometimes walked there alone to clear his mind. The threat was unmistakable. He was telling us that he knew where we lived, that he could reach us whenever he chose, that our investigation had made us targets. Emily's hand found mine, and I felt her trembling despite the warm summer air. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. She told him that we were not afraid of the dark, that we had grown up in these mountains and knew them as well as anyone. She told him that secrets never stayed buried forever, that the forest had a way of giving up what it held. It was a challenge, a declaration of war between 2 teenage girls and a man who had killed without consequence for decades. He smiled. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. The days following the festival were charged with a tension that made ordinary life impossible. Emily and I knew we were being watched, could feel eyes on us whenever we stepped outside our homes. Our parents noticed our fear without understanding its source, attributing it to the general anxiety that had gripped the community. We could not tell them the truth. We could not explain that we had identified the killer and that he now considered us threats to be eliminated. They would have dismissed our suspicions as teenage paranoia, or worse, they would have confronted Winters directly and put themselves in danger. I stopped sleeping through the night, lying awake in my bed listening to every sound the forest made, interpreting each rustle and crack as approaching footsteps. My father began to worry about my health, and my mother suggested that maybe leaving Mineral was the right choice after all. But I knew that leaving would not save us. A man like Daniel Winters would not let witnesses escape. We had to see this through to the end, whatever that end might be. Emily developed a plan. She reasoned that the only way to stop Winters was to find evidence so compelling that no authority could dismiss it, proof that would lead to his arrest and expose the decades of killing that had terrorized our region. She believed that proof existed somewhere in the forest, in whatever place Winters brought his victims, in whatever dark chamber held the remains of those who had disappeared. If we could find that place and document what was there, we could bring him to justice. The idea terrified me. But Emily had a way of making the impossible seem achievable, of transforming fear into determination. She reminded me of all the victims, of Thomas Riley and Patricia Holmes and the countless others whose names we did not even know. She reminded me of her grandfather's stories about the forest remembering everything, about echoes that waited to be heard. She asked me if I could live with myself knowing that we had the chance to stop a killer and chose safety instead. I could not. Neither could she. We began our preparations in secret, gathering supplies and studying maps of the forest. Henderson helped us, providing knowledge of the terrain that no official map could match. He had spent the weeks since his sighting searching for any trace of the man he had seen, and he had narrowed down the likely location to a region deep in the wilderness, far from any maintained trail. An old logging road, long abandoned and overgrown, led toward an area marked on historical maps as the site of a camp that had operated in the early 20th century. Henderson believed that was where Winters brought his victims, where generations of evil had found its sanctuary. I wrote letters to my parents that I hid in my room, to be found only if I did not return. Emily did the same. We were not being morbid. We were being realistic. We knew the danger we were walking into, knew that we might not come back. But we also knew that some things were worth the risk, that there are moments in life when you must choose between safety and justice, between self-preservation and doing what is right. We made our choice with open eyes. The morning of August 29th, Emily and I set out at dawn. We told our families we were hiking to a popular waterfall, a trail we had walked many times before. We carried packs with food, water, and the camera that Emily had borrowed from her father's store. Henderson had given us a rough map to follow, marked with landmarks and warnings about the terrain. He wanted to come with us, but his health was failing, the accumulated weight of years and war finally taking its toll. He made us promise to be careful, made us promise to turn back if the danger seemed too great. We made that promise. We did not keep it. The forest changed as we left the maintained trails behind. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out the sun until we moved through a perpetual twilight. The sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the ancient music of wind through branches and water over stone. We followed the old logging road, now little more than a suggestion beneath decades of growth, navigating by the landmarks Henderson had described. A lightning-scarred pine, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a creek crossing where the water ran red with mineral deposits. Each marker confirmed we were on the right path. Each step took us deeper into territory where no help would come if we needed it. We walked for hours, speaking little, conserving our energy for whatever lay ahead. Emily moved with the confidence of someone who had grown up in these woods, reading the terrain with instincts I could only admire. I followed her lead, trusting her judgment even as my own fear screamed at me to turn back. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to watch us, as if the trees themselves were aware of our presence and curious about our intentions. It was late afternoon when we found the first sign that we had reached the right place. A piece of fabric caught on a branch, faded and weathered, but clearly not natural. Emily photographed it while I scanned the surrounding forest for any sign of danger. The fabric was from clothing, a piece of shirt or jacket torn away by movement through dense underbrush. We were on the trail of something. The question was whether we were the hunters or the hunted. The old logging camp emerged from the forest like a wound in the earth. Wooden structures rotted and collapsed, claimed by decades of neglect and the relentless advance of nature. Rusted equipment lay scattered among the buildings, machinery that had once harvested trees now becoming part of the very forest it had sought to conquer. The camp should have been completely abandoned, reclaimed by wilderness and forgotten by humanity. Instead, we found signs of recent habitation. A path had been cleared through the debris, leading toward a structure at the far end of the camp. Unlike the other buildings, this one had been maintained, its roof patched, and its walls reinforced against the elements. Smoke stains darkened the chimney, suggesting fires had been lit within the past days or weeks. We approached with caution, every sense alert for the sound of footsteps or the click of a weapon. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes storms. Emily reached the door first. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open, her camera ready to document whatever we found. I followed her into the darkness, my eyes adjusting slowly to the dim interior. What we saw in that building has haunted my dreams ever since, has made me question whether any human being could sink to such depths of depravity while still wearing the mask of normalcy. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, images of people hiking and camping and enjoying the wilderness without any awareness that they were being watched. Some faces I recognized from missing person reports. Others were strangers, their fates unknown but easily guessed. Daniel Winters had been stalking victims for years, selecting them carefully, observing their patterns before he struck. The photographs were his trophies, visual records of the hunt that preceded each kill. In the center of the room stood a table covered with maps and notes. Emily photographed everything while I forced myself to examine the details, to document what we were seeing in my memory as well as on film. The maps showed routes through the forest, trails marked with dates and symbols that corresponded to the disappearances we had tracked. The notes described victims in clinical terms, their physical characteristics, their schedules, their likelihood of being missed. It was a predator's handbook, a guide to murder refined over decades of practice. A trapdoor in the floor led to a cellar below the building. The smell that rose from that opening was unmistakable, the scent of decomposition that no amount of time could completely eliminate. Emily wanted to descend, to document what was below, but I stopped her. We had enough evidence. We had enough proof. What we needed now was to survive long enough to share it with the world. But we had waited too long. As we turned toward the door, a figure filled the frame, backlit by the afternoon sun that filtered through the forest canopy. Daniel Winters had been waiting for us. He had known we would come, had perhaps even led us here through subtle manipulations we never detected. His patience had finally been rewarded. His prey had walked willingly into his lair. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally, as if we were guests he had invited rather than witnesses he intended to silence. He told us about his father, about the lessons he had learned in these very woods, about the bond they had shared over secrets too dark for the outside world to understand. He told us that some people were simply meant to disappear, that the forest needed to be fed, that he was merely fulfilling a natural role that civilization had forgotten. He believed every word he said. That was the most terrifying part. Emily began talking, buying time while her eyes searched the room for anything that might serve as a weapon. She asked him questions about his methods, his motivations, playing the journalist role she had always dreamed of fulfilling. I watched his attention focus on her, watched the gleam of pride as he explained his techniques, and I understood that his need for recognition was a weakness we could exploit. I moved slowly, imperceptibly, toward a rusted tool that lay near the wall. My fingers closed around the handle of what had once been a logging axe, its blade corroded but still bearing an edge. Winters continued talking, lost in the pleasure of finally having an audience for his life's work. He did not see me raise the axe. He did not see me swing. The impact caught him across the shoulder, not fatal, but enough to stagger him, to break his confident stance. Emily lunged for the door, grabbing my hand as she passed. We ran into the forest with the sound of his rage echoing behind us. Crashing through underbrush without thought for the trail, driven only by the primitive need to escape. He pursued us through the gathering darkness, and the forest that had been our home became a maze of shadows and terror. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs threatened to give out, until the rational part of my mind that could calculate direction and distance was overwhelmed by pure animal panic. Emily led the way, her knowledge of the terrain our only advantage against a man who had hunted these woods for decades. Night fell completely, and still we moved, guided by starlight when the canopy allowed and by faith when it did not. We could hear him behind us, sometimes close enough that his footsteps seemed to echo our own, sometimes falling silent in ways that were even more frightening. He was playing with us, we realized. He was enjoying the chase, extending our fear for his own pleasure. This was the game he had perfected over a lifetime of hunting human beings. We found temporary shelter in a rocky outcropping, a small cave that provided protection from above while leaving us exposed from the sides. We huddled together in the darkness, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our bodies trembling from exhaustion and terror. Emily still clutched her camera, the evidence of what we had discovered pressed against her chest like a talisman. I still gripped the axe, its weight a comfort even though I knew how little protection it truly offered. We talked in whispers, making plans that seemed absurd in the face of our situation. We estimated we were still miles from any help, deep in wilderness that would take hours to cross even in daylight without pursuit. Our only hope was to survive until dawn and then make our way to the highway, to flag down help or reach a ranger station. It was a slim hope, but it was all we had. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. We took turns keeping watch, though neither of us could truly sleep. Every sound made us start. Every rustle of wind through branches made us grip our makeshift weapons tighter. We talked about our lives, about the things we wanted to do, about the futures we were fighting to preserve. Emily told me about the articles she wanted to write, the injustices she wanted to expose, the difference she wanted to make in the world. I told her about my dreams of becoming a teacher, of helping young people find their voices the way she had helped me find mine. In that dark cave, surrounded by danger, we forged a bond stronger than any we had known before. Dawn came finally, gray light filtering through the forest canopy like a promise of salvation. We emerged from our shelter stiff and exhausted but alive. The forest looked different in the morning light, less threatening, more navigable. We oriented ourselves by the sun and began moving toward the west, toward the highway that represented safety and civilization. For a few precious hours, we allowed ourselves to believe we might actually survive. Daniel Winters attacked at mid-morning, emerging from a thicket so silently that neither of us heard his approach until he was upon us. He tackled Emily, sending her camera flying into the underbrush, his hands closing around her throat with practiced efficiency. I swung the axe with all the strength I had left, but he was ready this time, catching the handle and wrenching the weapon from my grip. He threw me aside like a discarded toy and returned his attention to Emily, his face twisted with the rage of a predator denied its rightful kill. I scrambled for any weapon I could find, my hands closing on a rock the size of my fist. I threw it with desperate aim, catching him on the side of the head, staggering him enough that his grip on Emily loosened. She gasped for air, clawing at his face, fighting with the fury of someone who refused to die quietly. Together, we fought him, two teenage girls against a man who had killed more people than we could count. We fought not with skill but with determination, not with strength, but with the absolute refusal to surrender. The struggle seemed to last forever, a chaos of blows and screams and desperate movement through the forest. I lost track of Emily, lost track of direction, lost track of everything except the need to survive one more second, one more moment. When the shotgun blast echoed through the trees, I thought for certain that one of us had died. Henderson stood at the edge of the clearing, his shotgun raised, his face carved with the determination of a man who had faced demons before and refused to bow to them again. He had followed us, had tracked our trail through the night despite his failing health, had pushed his damaged body beyond its limits because he knew we would need him. Daniel Winters lay on the ground, clutching a wound in his leg, his reign of terror ended by a single blast from a weapon wielded by a man who understood what true evil looked like. Emily was alive, bruised, bloodied, but alive. She had retrieved her camera during the chaos, had protected it even as she fought for her life. The evidence was intact. Our suffering would not be in vain. Henderson kept his weapon trained on Winters while I used rope from his pack to bind the killer's hands and feet. Winters cursed us, threatened us, promised that we would never be safe, that even from prison he would find ways to punish us for what we had done. His words washed over me without impact. He had no power now. He was just a wounded animal, dangerous only if we were foolish enough to let our guard down. We took turns supporting each other as Henderson led us out of the forest, following a route he had memorized decades ago during his own service in these mountains. It took us most of the day to reach the highway, hours of painful walking through terrain that seemed designed to exhaust what little strength we had left. But we made it. We emerged from the tree line and flagged down the first vehicle that passed, a logging truck whose driver took one look at our condition and immediately radioed for help. The authorities descended on Mineral in waves after that. FBI agents returned with reinforced numbers. State police established a perimeter around the old logging camp. Forensic teams spent weeks excavating the cellar below the building we had discovered, recovering remains that would eventually be identified as belonging to 17 different victims spanning 3 decades. The photographs Emily had taken became evidence in a case that made national headlines, exposing a legacy of murder that had hidden in plain sight for generations. Daniel Winters was tried and convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder. He never showed remorse, never admitted guilt, never abandoned his belief that he had been fulfilling some necessary role in the natural order. He died in prison 3 years later, taking whatever other secrets he held to a grave that would never be marked or honored. His father's crimes, covered up so many years before, were finally exposed as well, bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers about loved ones who had simply vanished. The trial brought media attention to Mineral that the community had never experienced before. Journalists flooded the town, seeking interviews with anyone connected to the case. Emily found herself at the center of that attention, her role in exposing the killer transforming her from a small-town teenager into a symbol of courage and justice. She gave her first interview at 17 years old, articulating with clarity and passion the importance of truth-telling even when it required personal risk. It was the beginning of the career she had always dreamed of pursuing. Henderson was honored by the community and the state for his role in ending Winters' spree. He deflected the praise with characteristic humility, insisting that the credit belonged to 2 brave young women who had done what he could not do alone. He lived another 4 years after that night in the forest, long enough to see Emily graduate from college with a degree in journalism, long enough to see the first article she published in a major newspaper. He died peacefully in his cabin, surrounded by the mountains he loved, having finally found the redemption he had sought since returning from Vietnam. 30 years have passed since that summer of terror, and I am no longer the frightened teenager who fled through the forest with evil at her heels. I became the teacher I dreamed of becoming, spending my career helping young people find their voices, encouraging them to question and investigate and never accept easy answers. I married, raised children, built a life that the girl hiding in that cave could never have imagined. But I never forgot Mineral. I never forgot what happened there. And I never stopped telling the story. Emily became the journalist she was destined to be. She wrote books about the Mineral murders, about the failure of authorities to connect decades of disappearances, about the ways that small communities can harbor enormous evil. She won awards, trained younger journalists, and built a career devoted to exposing the secrets that powerful people want to keep buried. She never married, claiming that her work was her first love, but I know that the truth is more complicated. The scars from that summer never fully healed. They shaped everything she became. We remain friends, Emily and I, bound by shared experience that no one else can truly understand. We talk every week, sometimes about our work, sometimes about our families, sometimes about nothing at all. On the anniversary of that August night, we call each other at dawn, checking in the way survivors do, confirming that we are still here, still standing, still refusing to let the darkness define us. The conversation never lasts long. It doesn't need to. The connection speaks for itself. Mineral has changed in the decades since the murders. The old-timers who remember that summer are mostly gone now, replaced by newcomers who know the history only as legend. The logging camp where we found the evidence has been demolished, the ground reclaimed by forests so thoroughly that no trace remains. The community has healed, as communities do, absorbing the trauma into its collective memory without being consumed by it. Children play in the streets again. Doors go unlocked. Life continues. But I go back sometimes, when the memories become too heavy to carry alone. I walk the trails that Emily and I walked, visit the lake where we dangled our feet in the water and dreamed of futures we could not yet imagine. I talk to the trees the way Emily's grandfather taught us, asking them what they remember, what echoes they still hold from those terrible months. The forest never answers, of course, but the silence feels different now, peaceful rather than threatening, as if the land itself has been cleansed by the exposure of its darkest secret. The story I have told you is not just about evil. It is about the courage of ordinary people who refuse to look away when injustice unfolds before them. It is about friendship that survives the worst circumstances imaginable. It is about the power of truth to overcome even the most entrenched lies. Daniel Winters believed that some people were meant to disappear, that the forest would always protect his secrets. He was wrong. The truth always finds a way to emerge, carried by voices that refuse to be silenced. I think often about the victims, about Thomas Riley and Patricia Holmes, and all the others whose names filled the files that prosecutors used to build their case. They came to our mountains seeking beauty and peace, trusting that nature would embrace them. They deserved better than what they found. But their stories have been told now. Their names are remembered. Their families received the answers they waited so long to hear. That is the only comfort I can offer, the knowledge that their suffering led to justice, that their deaths were not in vain. If you have stayed with me through this story, I ask you one final thing. Remember that evil often wears ordinary faces, that monsters can hide among us for years without detection. Remember that the difference between a victim and a survivor is often nothing more than the willingness to fight back, to refuse the role that predators assign to us. And remember that speaking the truth, no matter how dangerous, is always worth the risk. Emily and I were two teenage girls who stumbled onto something terrible and chose to act. We were not heroes. We were not special. We were simply human beings who decided that silence was not acceptable, that the lives of strangers mattered enough to risk our own. You have that same capacity within you. Everyone does. The question is whether you will use it when the moment comes. The forest remembers everything, Emily's grandfather told us. The trees absorb the echoes of what happens beneath their branches. I believe that now in ways I could not have understood as a frightened 16-year-old. I believe that every act of courage and every act of evil leaves traces in the world, ripples that spread outward and touch lives we will never know. What we did that summer sent ripples of justice through the decades, brought closure to the grieving and punishment to the guilty. That is the legacy Emily and I share, the echo we left in the forest. My name is Sarah Whitmore. I survived the Mineral, Washington murders. And I am still here, still telling the story, still refusing to let the darkness have the final word. The forest is quiet now. The dead are at peace. And somewhere in the mountains I once called home, the trees stand watch over a truth that will never again be buried. Share this story, not for algorithms or engagement, but because the victims deserve to be remembered. Subscribe so that stories like this continue to reach people who need to hear them. And if you know something about unsolved cases in your own community, Speak up. Be the voice that finally breaks the silence. Justice often arrives late, but it arrives. It always arrives.